Bobo Fay has spent more nights in the deep forest looking for Bigfoot than almost anyone alive. He is not a researcher or a scientist or a television presenter. He is a woodsman whose physical size, whose fieldcraft, and whose instinctive understanding of the terrain he works in gave Finding Bigfoot a capability in the deep wilderness that no studio production could manufacture. He has never discussed this investigation until 1 minute ago. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what Bobo just revealed is the one thing Finding Bigfoot was never supposed to say out loud. James Fay, Bobo to everyone who has ever spent 5 minutes in the Finding Bigfoot orbit, occupies a specific and irreplaceable position in the Bigfoot research community that his television profile has always undersold. The show's format positioned him as the comic relief, the large, enthusiastic, perpetually optimistic woodsman whose sheer physical presence in the forest made him useful as a size reference for track comparisons, and whose willingness to wade into any dark terrain, climb any ridge, or spend any number of hours in any weather condition doing call blasting made him invaluable as an operational asset in the field. That positioning was accurate as far as it went. What it did not capture, what the 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot's broadcast record only occasionally surfaced in ways that the audience could fully register, was the depth of the fieldcraft and the accumulated experiential knowledge that Bobo brought to every investigation the show conducted. He did not come to Finding Bigfoot as a television personality who happened to be interested in Bigfoot. He came as a man whose relationship to the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the broader North American wilderness had been built across decades of sustained presence in exactly the environments where the evidence for Bigfoot's existence is most concentrated. He understood those environments in the specific, practical, embodied way that only extended time in them produces. He read the terrain, the weather, the wildlife behavior, and the physical evidence of large animal presence with the instinctive accuracy of someone whose survival in those environments had depended on that reading. That understanding gave Bobo's assessments of the physical evidence the team encountered a credibility that the show's format did not always give him the space to fully articulate. When Bobo said something was significant, it was because his accumulated experience in comparable terrain had given him a reference framework for what significant looked like and what it did not look like, a distinction that the show's most serious viewers came to rely on his judgment to draw. When he said something was unlike anything he had encountered before, it carried the weight of a man who had encountered a great deal and who understood the difference between the extraordinary and the genuinely anomalous. The investigation he just revealed falls into the second category, not because what the team encountered was more dramatic than the prior season's most intense investigation mode, because it was more final. And Bobo is the person whose decades of fieldwork gave him the framework to understand what that finality meant in terms of what it confirmed about the question the show had been asking across its entire run. The investigation, whose details Bobo just revealed, was not generated by the Finding Bigfoot Productions standard location selection process. It did not emerge from the research team's review of BFRO report databases or from a witness contact who reached out to the show through its official channels. It came from Bobo's own knowledge of the terrain, from years of personal fieldwork in a specific section of the Pacific Northwest that he had been returning to independently of the show's production schedule, because the evidence he kept finding there across those independent visits had been building a picture that the show's investigation deployments had not yet been designed to fully address. Bobo's relationship to this location predated Finding Bigfoot by years. He had first visited the area during an independent research trip that the BFRO had organized in the period before the television production began, and what he had found on that first visit, the track density, the structural evidence, the acoustic activity during a single overnight stay, had produced in him the specific quality of recognition that his years of fieldwork had trained him to distinguish from the ordinary strangeness that the deep forest produces for people who spend enough time in it. This was not ordinary strangeness. The location had been actively producing evidence of a consistent and specific character across every visit Bobo had made to it in the years between that first trip and the investigation whose details he is now revealing. The track evidence at the location showed a distribution pattern consistent with territorial use rather than transient passage. Impressions in the soft ground of the creek systems and the forest floor, whose concentration in specific areas of the location indicated regular, repeated use of defined corridors rather than the random distribution that passing wildlife produces. The structural evidence, the tree manipulations, The branch constructions, the specific arrangements of natural materials that Bobo's fieldwork had given him the reference framework to assess, showed a sophistication and a consistency across the location's most active areas that his accumulated experience placed in a category distinct from anything the surrounding wildlife was capable of producing. And the acoustic environment of the location, the specific quality of the sounds the night produced when Bobo had spent overnights there on his independent visits, was something he has described in the limited prior references he has made to the location as the detail that kept bringing him back. The forest at this location sounded different, not frightening, not unusual in the ambient sense of a new environment producing unfamiliar sounds, different in the specific way that a place sounds when something in it is listening. Bobo's account of what he communicated to the Finding Bigfoot team in the period before the investigation was deployed at the location is one of the most significant elements of his reveal, because it establishes the specific expectations the team brought to the investigation and the relationship between those expectations and what the investigation actually produced. He did not build the team's anticipation by describing the location in dramatic terms. Bobo's communication style in the field is practical rather than theatrical. He describes what he has seen and what he has found and what his assessment of those things is, without the performative enthusiasm that the show's broadcast format sometimes wrapped around his contributions. What he communicated to Matt Moneymaker and the rest of the team in the pre-investigation briefing was exactly that, a practical, specific account of what his prior visits to the location had produced and what his assessment of that evidence suggested about the nature of the presence at the location. He told them the location was occupied, not visited, not transited, not the temporary range of a single individual. Occupied in the sense that his understanding of the territorial behavior patterns the prior evidence indicated suggested a resident population whose use of the location was consistent, established, and organized around the specific terrain features that his visits had identified as the focal points of the area's anomalous activity. He told them the physical evidence at those focal points was of a quality he had not encountered at any other location in his years of field research. The combination of track evidence, structural evidence, and biological material whose collection he had been careful not to disturb on his prior visits in the expectation that the right investigation deployment would eventually be organized around the location. He told Cliff Barackman specifically that the track evidence at the creek drainage focal points was going to be the most significant physical documentation opportunity either of them had encountered in their research careers. Cliff's response to that assessment, from a man whose track analysis expertise gave him the specific context to evaluate the claim, was to treat the investigation deployment as the most important the show had yet organized, and he told Renai that the location was going to challenge her framework in a way that none of the prior investigations had challenged it, not because he expected her to abandon her skepticism, he respected her skepticism and always had, but because what the location had been producing across his prior visits was evidence that her methodological framework was going to have to work very hard to account for conventionally. It did not account for it conventionally. What it produced instead is what Bobo's reveal addresses in full. The Finding Bigfoot team arrived at the location in the late afternoon and spent the initial hours of the investigation establishing the baseline documentation that the show's methodology required before any active investigation session could be conducted. Bobo guided the baseline survey with the specific knowledge of the location's geography that his prior visits had given him, directing the team to the creek drainage focal points where the prior physical evidence had been most concentrated, positioning the monitoring equipment at the approach corridors whose activity levels his previous overnight stays had established as highest, and identifying the specific areas of the location where the structural evidence from his prior visits remained visible as contextual documentation for what the baseline survey was establishing. What the team found during the baseline survey exceeded what Bobo's prior account had led them to anticipate, not in its general character, which was consistent with his description, but in its freshness. The physical evidence at the focal points was recent. The track impressions in the creek drainage soil whose condition Cliff Barackman assessed with the forensic precision his track analysis career had developed indicated activity within the prior 24 to 48 hours. The structural evidence at the primary focal point, the branch constructions and tree manipulations that Bobo had documented on his prior visits, had been added to and reorganized since his most recent independent visit, indicating ongoing use of the site in the period between visits. And the biological material visible at the primary nest structure was fresh enough that Ranai's field biology assessment placed its deposition within a day of the team's arrival. The location had been actively used within the prior 24 hours. Whatever was using it had been there the day before the team arrived and was not far away now. The baseline survey was still in progress when the first acoustic event occurred. Not a distant vocalization heard at the edge of audible range, a close, structured, directional sound that the team's audio equipment captured with a clarity that the prior prior season's acoustic documentation had not produced, and that Bobo identified immediately from his prior overnight experiences at the location as the specific sound the forest made when whatever lived there was acknowledging the presence of something new in its territory. The forest was not alarmed. It was paying attention, and it had been paying attention since before the team completed their first hour on the ground. The first night of the investigation produced evidence that Cliff Barackman subsequently described as the most evidentially significant single night's documentation in the Finding Bigfoot production's history. Track evidence documented at 4 separate locations within the investigation area during the active investigation session. Acoustic responses to call blasting that Matt Moneymaker assessed as coming from multiple independent sources at distances and from directions consistent with a coordinated response rather than individual territorial reaction, and thermal signatures at the tree line of the primary focal point that the cameras tracked for extended periods without resolving into any wildlife species whose behavior pattern matched what the monitoring documented. The second night was when the investigation moved from extraordinary into the territory, whose details Bobo has been carrying since the investigation concluded. The camp had been positioned at the edge of the primary focal point area, a deliberate decision whose logic was to put the investigation team in close proximity to the location's most active zone overnight, rather than at the distance that standard safety protocols might have suggested. Bobo's prior overnight experience at the location had informed that decision. He knew the active zone's nighttime character from his independent visits, and his assessment was that proximity rather than distance was the approach that would produce the most significant documentation. What he had not anticipated, what his prior overnight experience at the location had not produced, and therefore had not given him the experiential basis to predict, was the specific development that the second night generated at the camp position. Something approached the camp, not at the tree line, not at the outer boundary of the thermal camera's coverage range, not at the ambiguous middle distance that the prior season's most dramatic night investigation moments had typically occupied. Something approached to within a distance that Bobo's account characterizes with the specific precision of a man who has spent enough nights in the deep forest to calibrate proximity accurately. Close enough that the distinction between an organism choosing to approach and an organism that had decided the camp's position within its territory required direct assessment was not a distinction that needed to be drawn theoretically. Close enough that the sound of its movement through the undergrowth at the camp's edge was audible without equipment, and close enough that what the thermal cameras documented when their coverage captured it at that proximity is what the rest of Bobo's reveal addresses, and what Animal Planet's editorial process determined the audience could not be shown. The thermal camera coverage of the camp perimeter during the period of the approach documented something that the Finding Bigfoot production's prior 11 seasons of investigation had not produced at comparable proximity. A thermal signature whose characteristics, documented at a range that the camera's resolution was fully adequate to capture in detail rather than in the ambiguous outline that distance typically produces in the show's thermal footage, established the following with the specificity that close-range thermal imaging permits. The signature was bipedal, not the intermittent bipedalism of a bear investigating a scent or responding to a disturbance. The sustained, habitual, mechanically efficient bipedalism of a species for whom walking on 2 legs is the primary and natural mode of locomotion. The gait pattern visible in the thermal footage across the frames that captured the approach to the camp perimeter was analyzed by Bobo in real time with the practical biomechanical reference framework his years of close observation of large primate locomotion in field conditions had built, and his real-time assessment was that what the camera was showing him was bipedal locomotion of a quality and a fluency that no known North American species other than a human being produces. It was not a human being. The thermal signature's dimensions, the shoulder width, the overall body mass as indicated by the heat signature's size, the limb proportions visible in the camera's resolution at that range, placed it outside the human size range in a manner whose clarity the proximity of the documentation did not permit to be ambiguous. Bobo's account of reviewing the thermal footage in real time on the monitoring screen during the approach is the element of his reveal that communicates most directly what the experience of that night produced in a man whose decades of fieldwork had given him the most extensive experiential reference framework in the team for assessing exactly this category of evidence. He has described the moment of seeing the signature clearly on the monitor, seeing its dimensions, its bipedalism, its proximity, with a consistency across the different accounts of his reveal, that communicates something specific about what that moment produced in him. Not excitement, not the performance of excited discovery that the show's broadcast format had cultivated across 11 seasons. Something quieter, the quality of a man who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just seen it in a form that his entire prior search had not produced. Close, clear, and unambiguous in a way that the preceding years of ambiguous evidence had not been. What the cameras documented at the camp perimeter that night is what Animal Planet reviewed and what Animal Planet buried, and what it shows is what Bobo just described for the first time outside the production's internal record. The Finding Bigfoot team's response to what the thermal cameras were documenting at the camp perimeter during the approach is captured in the investigation's recording infrastructure and described by Bobo in his reveal with the plainness that his communication style has always applied to significant field events, not dramatized, not amplified, just described in the specific terms that make clear what happened and what each team member's response to it was. The team was together at the monitoring position when the approach occurred. They were not distributed across the investigation area in the deployment configuration that the active investigation sessions used. They had returned to the camp position for a scheduled equipment check and were reviewing the monitoring feeds together when the signature appeared in the perimeter camera coverage. All four of them saw it simultaneously. Bobo's account of what each team member's response was in the moment the signature resolved on the monitor is one of the most humanly significant elements of his reveal, because the specific quality of each response communicates something about what the signature's close-range clarity produced in people with different relationships to the evidence that Bigfoot research produces. Matt Moneymaker went quiet in a way that Bobo describes as unlike his typical response to significant evidence, not the organized, analytically engaged quiet of a researcher processing a finding, but the specific silence of a man whose entire professional life has been organized around the pursuit of exactly what the monitor was showing him, confronting it at last in a form that his professional framework was not fully adequate to process. Cliff Barackman picked up his documentation equipment and began recording the monitor feed with a methodical precision that Bobo describes as the most focused he had ever seen Cliff operate in a field situation. Not excited, not hesitant, just completely absorbed in the documentation task in a way that reflected his understanding that what was on the monitor was what his forensic research career had been building toward. Ronnie Holland said one word. Bobo does not reproduce the word in his reveal. He describes it only as the word that a scientist who has spent 11 seasons applying rigorous skepticism to the evidence for Bigfoot's existence says when the evidence in front of her exceeds the explanatory reach of the skeptical framework she has been applying. The word communicated that her framework had reached its limit. Whatever she said in that moment is in the production's audio record. Whether it will ever be in the broadcast record is the question that Animal Planet's editorial decision about the investigation's footage has kept unanswered. Animal Planet's decision to pull the footage from the investigation Bobo is describing was communicated to the Finding Bigfoot production within a time frame that he characterizes in his reveal as faster than any prior editorial decision in the show's 14-season broadcast history. Not deliberated, not subjected to the extended review process that content decisions of comparable significance typically require in the operational rhythm of a cable television network. Made quickly, communicated clearly, and implemented with a totality that reflected institutional certainty rather than editorial consideration. Bobo's account of how the decision was communicated to the team is one of the most revealing elements of the entire disclosure, because the manner of the communication told the team as much about the nature of the decision as the decision itself. It did not come with an editorial justification. Networks that pull content for ordinary content management reasons provide explanations. The evidence is too ambiguous for the show's evidentiary standard. The footage raises legal concerns about the location's owner. The content exceeds the network's programming parameters for its audience. The communication about the investigation footage provided none of those conventional justifications. It provided an instruction. The footage was not to be broadcast. The investigation was not to be referenced. The production was to proceed with its schedule as though the investigation had not occurred. Bobo's response to that instruction, and to the decision it represented, is something he describes in his reveal with a candor whose quality reflects the specific position he has always occupied in the Finding Bigfoot operation as the team member whose practical field orientation made him the least embedded in the institutional frameworks that complicate the other team members' responses to the editorial relationship with the network. He did not accept the justification because no justification was offered. He did not accept the decision as an ordinary editorial call because the speed and the totality of it was not consistent with ordinary editorial process. What he accepted What the years since the investigation have produced in him in terms of his understanding of what the decision represented and why it was made is a conclusion about the institutional calculation that Animal Planet performed when its review of the investigation footage produced the suppression decision. The network understood what the footage showed. It understood what showing it would mean for the audience's relationship to the question the show had been asking across 11 seasons, and it made the calculation that what showing it would mean was something it was not willing to produce. Bobo accepted that calculation long enough to stay silent about the investigation. He has now decided the silence has lasted long enough. James Fay has spent more time in the forests where Bigfoot is reported to exist than almost any other living person. The investigation he just revealed is where that time finally arrived at its destination. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a blurry image at distance. Thermal footage at close range on a specific night at a specific location that his decades of fieldwork gave him everything he needed to understand. He does not frame what he saw as a belief. He frames it as something he saw on a monitor, close enough to be clear, documented well enough to be unambiguous, and buried by the network before the audience could see it, because the audience seeing it would have made the question Finding Bigfoot had been asking for 11 seasons impossible to keep asking. 11 seasons of thermal signatures and acoustic responses and track evidence were the approach. The investigation nobody was allowed to see was the arrival. Animal Planet made sure the audience never got there. Bobo just took them there anyway, in the plainest terms he knows, the way he has always done everything in those forests, without performance, without doubt, and without any more silence about what he saw